It was a warm spring day on Friday, April 25th, 2008, in Aiken, South Carolina, when 47-year-old Ann Fox Smith didn't show up for work. Ann was a beloved special education teacher at Kennedy Middle School, and this was definitely out of the ordinary. As the day went on with no word from Ann, her friend and fellow teacher, Sally Ferriter, drove to Ann's house on Whitney Drive to check on her. As she stepped from the sunny spring day into Ann's home, she did not realize she was moments away from a life-altering discovery. Ann Fox Smith lay dead on the floor in a blood-spattered bedroom. Welcome to Bitter Endings, a true crime podcast. I'm your host, J.R. Erickson. In Bitter Endings, I'll bring you stories of those taken too soon, the silent many who no longer have a voice through which to seek justice. Before we get into today's episode, I just have a couple of comments. First, I've decided to go ahead and start a Patreon account as well as a Buy Me a Coffee account. These are basically ways that listeners can offer support to myself as the host. This is a solo show and it does take quite a bit of time to do the research, the recording, and the editing, as well as the cost in hosting the podcast. If you are interested in doing that, you can find links in the show notes. The Patreon levels will likely change at some point. For new patrons in the next month or several months, I'm not sure how long I'll run this. If you donate at the $5 a month level, you will receive a free audiobook from either my Troubled Spirit series or my Northern Michigan Asylum series. And there are other tiers that you can donate at. The Buy Me a Coffee link will take you to a page that gives you an option to do a one-time donation, so essentially to buy me a coffee. If you are interested in either of those, you can find the links in the show notes. Thank you for listening. Ann Fox Smith was born on November 12, 1960, to parents Carl Lewis Fox Jr. and Marcia Mansfield Fox in Atlanta, Georgia. Ann was the youngest of 3 children, the baby of the family, with an older sister, Helen, and an older brother, John. Ann graduated from Presbyterian College and then went on to receive her master's degree from Converse College with the dream of becoming a school teacher. Eventually, that dream would come true, and Ann would become a teacher at Kennedy Middle School, focusing on special education. Ann was also active in the Aiken Debutante Society and the Cotillion Club. On July 31, 1983, Ann married Wilson Smith Jr., who was also a graduate of Presbyterian College. Wilson had a degree in chemistry. Eventually, the couple moved to Aiken, South Carolina, where Ann would begin her job as a teacher at Kennedy Middle School. The couple would go on to have 3 children, including daughter Lauren and sons Wilson III and Larson. The couple moved to Aiken, South Carolina in 1988. In 1995, Wilson, Ann's husband, became the chief instructor at Twin Dragons Martial Arts and Fitness. In his bio on the Twin Dragons page, Wilson referred to himself as an electron microscopist by day and a karate instructor by night. Ann's sister Helen described her as lots of fun. She said that Ann loved to joke. She loved to help children and animals. She even rescued squirrels. Helen said, quote, "I remember she would get those little squirrels after they fell out of their nest and she would feed them with an eyedropper. After she died, I was cleaning out her house and I saw 5 squirrels outside. I think they were giving her a goodbye salute." As mentioned previously, Ann was a special education teacher at Kennedy Middle School, and she also taught classes for the hearing impaired. She was talkative and kind. She loved people and adored her own 3 children. Her friends at Kennedy Middle School described her as always laughing. She'd show up late sometimes, just by a few minutes, strolling into the room with a giant smile on her face. By most accounts, Ann lived a happy life. Her home was filled with family photos. She often had boxes of items waiting to be donated to local charities. Ann was pretty, with light blonde hair and blue eyes and a wide, winning smile. At the time of Ann's death, she was not living with her husband, Wilson Smith Jr., and it appears that things were strained in their relationship. I believe the only child living at home with Ann in 2008 was her 17-year-old son, Larson. So let's step back there now to Friday, April 25th, 2008, in Aiken, South Carolina. It was a warm, bordering on hot spring day. Temperatures were approaching 80 degrees. And for Ann, a middle school teacher, summer was on the horizon. It's an exciting time at school for both teachers and students as spring begins its transition to summer, and the days move ever closer to that much anticipated summer break. Ann lived in a nice ranch home on a street called Whitney Drive. When I looked at Google Maps, it looked like Whitney Drive was both a dirt road and a dead end. The houses were situated on large tree-filled lots, including Ann's, which meant not a lot of traffic likely traveled down her road, and neighbors probably did not have an unobstructed view of her driveway or her yard. As I mentioned, it was a Friday, yet another day that's often full of energy and excitement at school, and this was likely no different at Kennedy Middle School. But what was different on that Friday was that Ann never arrived, and this was very out of the ordinary. Another teacher at Kennedy Middle School, Sally Ferriter, who was also Ann's friend, tried to reach her, but to no avail. When she still hadn't heard from Ann at lunchtime, Sally drove to Ann's house, arriving around 1 p.m. to check on her. She was surprised to find the back door to Ann's home unlocked. She walked inside and down the hallway to a back bedroom. Sally made a horrifying discovery. She found a bloody scene and Ann lying dead on the floor. She appeared to have been stabbed in the neck many times. Sally tried to take Ann's pulse but found no signs of life. Sally would later call the killing, quote, brutal, and something committed by a monster. Investigators descended upon Ann's home and they searched, collecting evidence which would also include DNA evidence. But they did not find the murder weapon in the home, nor did they find any evidence of forced entry. The news of Ann's murder was devastating to her family. Her older sister, Helen, said that she received a phone call in the afternoon on the day Ann died. Her niece, Ann's daughter, was on the line sobbing. Helen was 13 years older than Ann and said she'd at times felt like more of a mother figure than a sister to Ann. After Ann was murdered, Helen again took on the role of mother, now to Ann's grieving children. Helen had never had children of her own. Ann's youngest son, Larson, who again was 17 when his mother died, initially moved in with his father, Wilson Jr. But according to a 2011 article in the Post and Courier, Larson's relationship with his father was strained, and 6 months after Ann's murder, Larson moved in with Ann's sister Helen in their home in Augusta. A memorial service was held on Tuesday, April 29, 2008, at Millbrook Baptist Church. Ann was laid to rest in the Oakland Cemetery in Atlanta, Georgia. The coroner concluded that Ann had been dead less than 12 hours when her body was found on Friday, April 25th, and she died from stab wounds. So this leaves a time frame of murder if we're just looking at that basic 12-hour period from 1 a.m. to 1 p.m. And I would imagine that police have a clearer view about the time frame based on if Larson had been home that morning and had left for school, or if he hadn't been home based on what Ann was wearing, if she had been in the process of getting ready for school, if she'd still been in her pajamas. I don't have that information. Police have been pretty tight-lipped about a lot of their investigative findings. According to an article on WMBF News, police did find DNA at the scene. Lieutenant Daniel Turno said the DNA would likely be connected to the killer. However, after it was submitted for testing, it turned out to be DNA that was only linked to Ann herself. Police did take DNA samples from Ann's husband and her 2 teenage sons, but again, nothing at the murder scene was linked to the 3 men, and I don't believe there was additional unknown DNA. In the days after Ann's death, her daughter was quickly ruled out as a suspect, and later her son Larson was also ruled out. Her estranged husband and eldest son, however, were not. Ann's husband would continue to be a person of interest for investigators. Both he and his eldest son, Wilson III, hired attorneys after Ann's murder. In addition to Ann's family, her community and coworkers were heartbroken by Ann's death. Ben Osborne, the principal at Kennedy Middle School, said that the other teachers at the school were completely shocked by Ann's murder. Pat Silva, Aiken County's Director of Special Education, told a reporter after the murder, quote, "We're all affected. It's a great loss. This is devastating to a school and family." Ann's friend Margie Ritchie, who Ann had roomed with during her junior year at Presbyterian College, said that Ann embodied the motto of their alma mater, quote, "As we live, we serve." Ritchie also said, quote, "I believe that her heart for her students at Kennedy demonstrated her commitment to the core meaning of her education." Despite the desperation within Ann's family and in her larger community for answers, the police investigation seemed to stall relatively quickly in the months after Ann died. About 3 months after detectives with the Aiken Department of Public Safety started looking into Ann's murder, they asked the FBI to get involved. They were struggling to find enough evidence to pinpoint a viable suspect. Police eventually compiled a list of several suspects. Again, the primary focus seemed to be on Ann's estranged husband, Wilson Smith Jr. Police referred to him as uncooperative regarding the investigation into Ann's murder. Ann's husband retained defense attorney Bob Hart. Bob Hart would later attend a press conference in which investigators said that Wilson Smith Jr., Ann's estranged husband, had been uncooperative. Hart disagreed. He said, quote, "In fact, he met with investigators on 3 different occasions." Investigators with Aiken Public Safety said this was not true. They said that they had attempted multiple times to interview Wilson Smith Jr. about Ann's murder, and he had repeatedly declined. Lieutenant David Turno said, quote, "Initially, he was contacted when we informed him and her other family members about the murder. But since he retained Bob Hart, he has never granted us an interview." Again, Hart disagreed, saying that Wilson had offered to answer any questions that were posed to him. Aiken investigators retorted, saying that they were eager for a chance to speak with Wilson and that they were extending an invitation to him to come to the station and talk with them. They said, quote, "Our investigators want to speak with him and interview him and his close associates who have also refused to cooperate with us." Regarding some of the challenges that investigators had in finding a suspect in Ann's case, Lieutenant Turno said in an article on WMBF, quote, "The perpetrator didn't stay on the scene. They didn't wait for us to arrive. There wasn't any big clue. He or she didn't drop a driver's license to lead us to him," end quote, which I guess seemed a little odd as a comment because what perpetrator does do most of those things, and there wouldn't be much of an investigation if the perpetrator did wait on the scene or leave a driver's license. In any case, one development that came in Ann's murder was a criminal profile of the likely murder suspect. Michael Proden, who worked for the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division Behavioral Science Unit, was the one who created this profile. And this profile was released at the press conference that I was speaking about a minute or two ago, and I will read what that profile said. And this profile was broken down in a 2011 article in the Post and Courier. The profiler, Proden, said, quote, "This is not a random murder. There was a personal cause. The victim posed a problem, and that problem was solved by the murderer." The profile also ruled out the possibilities of either robbery or rape as potential motives, again, pointing to a more personal reason that the murderer had to kill Ann. The profile also stated that the person who killed Ann was likely a man and someone who knew her well. Based on the brutal murder, the killer was likely filled with rage. He was most likely very familiar with Ann's home as well as her habits. The killer likely knew that Ann would be home and alone the morning that she was murdered, and that this would be a vulnerable time for her and an ideal time to attack her and not be caught. Proden, the profiler, also said the murderer was likely not remorseful about having killed Ann, and it was very possible that he actually felt good that he had done it. The killer might have exhibited a change in appetite or alcohol use following the murder. Proden also said, quote, "Investigators think from past experience that offenders often follow the investigation and have an interest in both rumors and gossip in the community and media. He may talk about the murder with friends, associates, or family." So again, the likely killer would be closely following the investigation into Ann's murder. The likely killer would also probably ask friends and family about the murder, but he would pretend to be sort of disinterested or non-committal, as if he did not have anything at stake in the killer being caught. He might also find a way to ask friends and family of Ann if they had spoken to investigators and what kinds of things they had told investigators. Proden also said that the murderer might make statements blaming the victim, things like, quote, "She should not have been alone." Proden also went on to say that often in a case like Ann's murder, there are people who are close to the perpetrator who suspect that he committed this crime, but they simply don't want to believe it. And because they don't want to believe it, they choose not to cooperate with police, or they outright lie or mislead investigators. Regarding this in particular, Proden said that it was important for those who were close to the potential killer to understand that this is a person who might strike out unpredictably, especially if he thinks the person knows what he did and that they might turn him in. And I think we see a little bit of the fear around speaking out in Anne's case because there were several articles where friends and family members of Anne stated that they were worried about naming the person they suspected had done it for fear of being harmed themselves. And in particular, I will talk about Sally Ferriter, who was the teacher and also the friend of Anne's who found her body. She did not speak to the press for months after Anne died. And when she did, she spoke to a reporter with WMBF News. And she said that she hadn't previously spoken to reporters because she feared that Anne's killer was watching and listening. But she also said she felt a duty to Anne to come forward and to talk and to make sure that her name stayed on people's minds and in the news. In that same article, Sally mentioned that there was nothing Anne wouldn't do for her students, from nursing baby squirrels to dressing up like a cheerleader if she thought it would make them happy. Anne's sister Helen also talked about what a dedicated teacher Anne was and how she loved her kids and she would do anything for them. Helen said, quote, "I remember when she died, I had parents coming up to me saying they didn't know what they were going to do without her because she connected with their children in a way that no one else could." After Anne was murdered, a bench was erected in her honor outside of Kennedy Middle School. I'll also mention that Helen was a person who clearly seemed to have a sense of who she believed murdered Anne, but again felt that she was not able to speak out about that person. In an article with the Post and Courier, Helen said, quote, "It's hard to go a year without having an opinion. It's been a tough year. Let's just leave it at that." She also said, "This was no ordinary murder. Professionals say it was a brutal, horrific crime, well planned and executed by someone who knew what they were doing." She had her own suspicion about who, quote, brutally killed Anne, but that she didn't want to answer that question outright. She did, however, say that she believed someone in Aiken knew something, and maybe they weren't even aware that they knew something. And again, I think this comes back to that idea of coming forward with any little thing. If you saw a car in the vicinity that day, if you saw a person leaving her home, if you know someone who was close to Anne and they acted strangely in the days after her murder. And that's obviously complicated by when you are close to someone who is murdered, in all likelihood, you are going to behave abnormally. So I don't have a lot more information about the murder of Anne Fox Smith. I'll just talk briefly about the speculation regarding the case, and it does seem to center on someone who knew Anne well, and in particular, it seems to center on Wilson Smith Jr., and there was a court document that was at some point released in the press that stated that Wilson Smith Jr. was a suspect in the murder of Anne Fox Smith. However, there were few details beyond the fact that he had been stated thus. And again, police have kept their investigation pretty secret. I'll also link to an article that I found on NPR that quoted a statistic by the CDC that half of all female homicide victims are killed by intimate partners. And so I think that's why in pretty much any murder, a boyfriend or a husband quickly becomes under suspicion. And it's not simply because they are someone who is close and someone who has access. It is because statistically, they are much more likely to be the murderer than a random person coming in off the street or a stranger who that person encountered. And again, I don't have details here, but she was in some regards separated from her husband. And I don't know that they were legally separated, but they were living in different residences. And in newspaper articles I found, he was referred to as estranged, not to mention that police considered him a person of interest or a suspect in her case. I think this also makes a lot of sense in terms of it being someone that she was very close to, that knew her habits, because she had a 17-year-old son that lived with her. She worked at a middle school. There is a relatively small window of opportunity to attack her, knowing that she will be alone in her home. So it does seem likely that someone who was aware of that is the person who came upon her that morning or snuck up on her, because they knew how to get into her house and at what time they could catch her unaware. This, I think, is also reinforced by the location of her home in kind of an off-the-beaten-path sort of place. This wasn't a through road that a lot of people drove. It was a dirt road. It was a dead end. You pretty much were only driving down that road if you knew someone living on it. What's the likelihood that you would randomly choose that road, randomly choose a house, and it would be a woman in there alone getting ready? And if it was random, what was the purpose of the murder? Every year on the anniversary of Anne's death, her older sister, Helen Morgan, goes to the bench that was erected at Kennedy Middle School in Anne's honor. Helen lays flowers on the bench to remember her sister. Anne's murder is a cold case. More than a decade has gone by since she was killed. In a 2018 article in the Post and Courier, Captain David Turno said that Anne's case is still open, and he asks anyone who may have information to reach out to investigators. He said, quote, "We've had a number of leads over the years that we always followed up on, but they just haven't led us anywhere. Nothing has led to enough evidence to get a warrant against any specific suspect." Reporters asked Turno why he felt that Anne's case had been so difficult to solve, and he said, quote, "Sometimes cases go that way. We still feel that someone out there may have information that over time, maybe they're going to feel more comfortable calling us or reaching out to us." So with that in mind, if you have any information regarding the unsolved murder of Anne Fox Smith on April 25th, 2008 in Aiken, South Carolina, please call Aiken Public Safety at 803-642-7620 or Crime Stoppers of the Midlands at 1-888-CRIME-SC. Today's episode is sponsored by the Troubled Spirit series. The Troubled Spirit series are a fictional paranormal murder mystery series inspired by true crimes. If you are interested in the novels, you can find them on Amazon by searching for Troubled Spirits, or you can find a link in the show notes. You can also listen to the previous episodes of the Bitter Endings podcast, which highlight the cases that have inspired the first two novels in the series. The first novel, Dark River Inn, was inspired by the case of Heather Teague, which is episode 18. And the second novel in the series, Helm House, was inspired by the true crime story of Joan Risch, which I covered in episode 24 on the podcast. Thank you again for listening and have a safe day.